our January Birders Night for Salem Audubon, and it's generally our night to share. So we've got 4 people lined up tonight who are going to talk about birds and pictures they've taken of them and what those birds are doing. Sorry about the glare on my glasses. I'll take them off. I have one quick announcement before I turn it over to Tim. I think he's got at least one announcement. We are planning at this point to have combination in-person and Zoomed meetings in February and March. So watch your newsletter or watch the website for further information. But at this point, we are hoping that COVID will allow us to have our first in-person meeting in more than a year and a half. And we will also Zoom that meeting for people who are either uncomfortable or whatever reason can't attend or are out of the area. We're getting a lot of Zoom attendees now from other parts of Oregon and the Western United States. Tim, I think you've got at least 1 or 2 exciting announcements.
Yeah, well, one announcement, a special announcement. For those of you who haven't heard, we're going to open the Nature Center to the public for the first time in too long. We're going to open it on February 5th. And so that will be outdoor activities only with social distancing. But we got some activities for visitors for the first week. Pat and Bobby O'Leary are organizing that. And if you'd like to be part of the volunteer base that gets that first week up and running and be on the ground floor for the volunteer activities out there, I recommend you contact Pat and Bobby, and you can reach them anytime at volunteer@ankenyhillnaturecenter.org. So it's a real exciting thing. And now with field trip announcements. I think Cynthia has something to say.
Yes, we have an upcoming field trip on, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. On Friday, the 14th to Lincoln City and Point South. Then we also have one of our regularly scheduled Ankeny trips. And then we also have St. Louis Fish Pond trip. And then in February, early trips would be again to Minto Brown and to Willow Lake. And then we have more of our regularly scheduled trips. So anyway, just watch the Kestrel. And now I'm supposed to turn it over to Kathy, I think. No, Judy.
Judy.
Sorry, Judy.
It's okay. I come on later.
Tonight we have photo sharing from 4 different groups. And that we have a varied program of bird photos and stories. Well, the first one actually isn't about birds. It's about cheetahs. We have Cynthia Donald, who is a board member of Salem Audubon. And in 2015, she and 2 of her daughters were fortunate to visit the Kalahari Desert in South Africa. And one evening, they spotted a family of cheetahs as they were just becoming active, and were able to follow them for quite a while until darkness fell. And so I'm going to let Cynthia show us the photo. Is it a video or photos, Cynthia?
It's photos.
Photos.
Just a few.
Show us the photos that they were able to take when this adventure happened. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay. Well, that's great. So I'll start by saying good evening. It's at least dinner time for me, so I always think about that. And the last week of November in 2015, two of my children, one of whom is my son and one of whom is my daughter, and I were out in the Kalahari Desert. And we came upon a cheetah family, and we were able to follow them for several hours after they started to wake up until we lost our light. So I'm just going to take you on a brief, very brief little journey to another part of the world. There are no birds in this at all. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Kalahari, if you see the darker brown extent, that is the true Kalahari, and the orange extent around that is what they call the Kalahari Basin. And the basin, although it's part of what is called the Kalahari, it also has savannas and a few mountains and some different types of vegetation, and it gets a little more rain if you're down in this area. This is where we were. If you can see my cursor, we were down in this part of South Africa. And this country, this large country on the bottom of the continent is South Africa. This country up here to the left and above it is Namibia, and the country on top of it is Botswana. So I'm hoping that those of you who have kids can relate to part of this. I certainly could with my kids. So this is what the Kalahari looks like in this particular part of Africa. You can see these low mountain ranges. There are also some dune areas. While most of it is this beautiful red desert, there are areas where you would have streams, and you do have some pretty significant vegetation there. So here they are. Here's Mom on the right. And even though you can only see two little heads, there are actually three cubs here. Cheetah cubs are born usually in between March and May, which is the beginning of the winter time in South Africa. And they stay with their mom usually between 18 to 24 months, unless something happens and they don't live that long. But these were pretty good sized kids. So these are definitely well over a year old. So here's what kids do. This is what my kids would do. They'd yawn. Ones that were trying not to wake up would just sort of lay there in bed going, I really don't want to get up. And then they'd get up a little bit more. And then they'd lay back down. And here you can see all three of the kids. And these are subadult cheetah. And they sit up and look around. And then they lay back down. But here's Mom. Mom is finally waking up. And what do cats do when they first wake up? Well, there's a little bit of like, you know, let's clean ourselves. Let's make sure all of our hairs are in place. And we'll go and do that. And then after we've done that, we'll do a big, big, long stretch. And here's Mom again doing that. You can see that the kids have flopped back down. They're just like, really, Mom, you could bring us food. You used to always bring us food, but now you want us to come and help. So anyway, here's Mom back down, and she's cleaning one of her cubs and still cleaning on it. This other cub down here on the left is actually focused on me. He knew we were there. And he was like, what is that? What are those people? There were just 4 of us, actually. My 2 children, me, and our guide. And we were a good distance away. And I do not have a good camera, as any camera person will tell you. So anyway, here we are finally scratching. Let's get scratched. And off we go. Off we go to hunt. Mom is on the left, sitting down, and one of her subadult kids is just to the right of her. And they're just kind of checking the scenery out. And you can tell by the shadows and the color of the light that it's getting late in the day. And here's mom sitting and two of the cubs looking out in a different direction across the savanna. And here they are. There's all three of them walking. Mom is the big one right here in the middle. One cub is here, a second cub is here, and a third cub is here. And these are just gorgeous, gorgeous, remarkable animals. You can see the grass savanna in the foreground. You can see the line of acacia trees, and you can see these low mountains in the back. So it's quite a really interesting and varied habitat. And here's mom. She spotted something. And she's not quite sure. And I love it. They will stop. You can see that her left hind foot is up. And when she is focused on something, on in this case, it was antelope that they were after, that she was after, they will stay stationary, even if there's a foot off the ground for quite a long time. And this is the second to last shot I was able to get. She had made the kids sit down under an acacia tree because she was going down further into the savanna because there was a herd of antelope there. And she made the kids stay back. And I did ask our guide, I said, well, what happens if the kids decide they don't want to stay back? He said, well, normally what happens is because they're not old enough to hunt successfully yet, is that they will scare off the game, and so no one gets dinner that night. So I did look at my two children, each of whom was adult at this time, quite adult, and I just said, you know, I never thought of doing that to you guys. And the last shot I took, here's this one kid again on the left, who's like not focused on mom, he's focused on us, because at this point, I took this last shot, and we started our vehicle, and off we went. And here are my two kids, terrible photo, but that's what they look like when we were done. And I will leave you with the lovely sunset across the Kalahari Desert.
Thank you, Cynthia, for sharing that adventure with us. There are some questions here.
Yes.
Let's see. The mom has a collar. There was a question about why would the mom?
She does. She has a radio collar on. We were on the largest private reserve in South Africa. It's 100,000 hectares, which is just short of 250,000 acres.
Wow.
And if you would like a relationship of how large that is, it's about a third the size of the state of Rhode Island. So it's very significant. And they are, this game reserve is in the process of keeping and reestablishing this portion of the Kalahari Desert, and they do it through ecotourism. So some of their animals that are more nomadic do have radio collars on. It's for two reasons, mainly so they can keep track of them and make sure that when the mother, for example, this cheetah had given birth, that they could find her and they could see the state of the young and make sure that they were okay.
And someone wants to know, what was the name of this reserve?
Its name is Swallow, and that's spelled T-S-W-A-L-U. And if you're going to South Africa, it's well worth it.
And how close is it to Kruger?
Oh, it's a long way.
A long way.
It's a long way. You don't want to have to drive.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that. It was very fun to see.
My pleasure, and sorry there weren't any birds, but hey, you guys know I'm not a photographer, so that's just the way it is.
Right, but Audubon is also interested in other wildlife as well, so.
Good, so am I.
Fabulous photos, fabulous photos.
Yes.
No, not really. I'm not a photographer. I'm an adventurer.
Good adventure.
Moving on to our second presenter. Our second presenter is Gretchen Johnson. Gretchen recently moved to Salem after retiring as a medical doctor. And she currently lives in a downtown apartment. So she has very easy access to Waterfront Park. And during the pandemic, she took up birding as a way to keep herself from going stir crazy, and began visiting the park every day. Borrowed a camera one time and found out she loved taking pictures of birds. So Gretchen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Judy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'll share my screen. I think, let's see. Anna, I might need your help. Let's see. Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, got it. Get through here. All right.
There you go.
My slides here. Yeah, so I'm going to show some photographs that I took with my Canon PowerShot, which is just a digital point and shoot camera. Most of the pictures are from October and November of 2021, and they're all from Salem Riverfront Park. So why Riverfront Park? Well, as Judy said, it's downtown, so I can either walk there or stop off after running errands in my car. It's very convenient for me, so I go there a lot. Second, it's a safe place to hang out. There are a lot of people there. The paths are accessible, they're paved. There's places to sit, benches, covered picnic tables. And third, there are real bathrooms, which is always a plus for me, no porta potties there. And fourth and lastly, there are a lot of birds there. eBird lists 125 species that people have seen there, and I've probably seen about between 65 and 70 species of birds there myself. So it's a good place to go. Picture of the park in the fall. It doesn't look like that right now. A lot of the leaves are gone. And usually when I go in the park, I start near the carousel and I walk down toward the direction of the statue of Tom McCall, and then go down by the floating dock because you can get pretty close to the water there and see some birds that way. And then I walk along the slough towards the big globe and stay in this area. Sort of right in here is a nice place to stand and look for birds because you've got the brush, you've got the creek, and in the warmer months you've got mud down there, so you see a nice variety of birds in that area. And then I always walk up on the pedestrian bridge because you get a good view from up there as well. And I take photos to help me as a new birder. It helps me identify the birds I'm seeing, and I can look at them later. And I also like to put photos with my eBird list as much as possible because it just makes my eBird list like little travelogues of my birding adventures, and I enjoy that. So I'm going to show you some of the birds that I've seen and been able to photograph at the park. I tried to put them loosely into groups, and I put a delay on the name of the bird. So if you want to test yourself as you go along, you can do a little quiz. And I'm going to start with the ducks because they're the most common birds that you'll see at the park. And that's a pretty mallard. They're nice ducks to take photos of because they're so colorful, especially this time of year. And a lot of them are pretty tame in the park too, so you can get pretty close to them and get nice photographs. But you can also see some of the less common ducks there as well. It's a nice ring-necked duck. These two ladies on the log getting some sun, common mergansers. A couple more pictures looking down on them from the bridge, so you get a different viewpoint than you might at some other places when you're up on the bridge. This gentleman, of course, a hooded merganser.
Say them before the board comes in. That's what
This little diving duck, bufflehead. I call these lesser scops, but if anybody thinks they're greater scops, I'm not an expert, but I thought they had kind of peaked heads, and probably a lesser scop is more common in that area too.
Yes, in general, greater scalp stay in saltwater, deep bays, estuaries along the coast, and they have a round head. These guys clearly have an angle at the back of their head, and lesser scalp is what you would expect probably 98% of the time in the Willamette Valley.
Great, thanks, Harry.
You're right.
And then in the middle of the scalps was another duck, little ruddy duck. And definitely see Canada and cackling geese. I haven't seen any other geese except the little guy down in the right-hand corner, I think is a domestic hybrid. Is that what you would call a swan goose? I've heard that term, but I don't know if you can see it. Definitely see a lot of these guys. High-billed grebes. And then for a few weeks, we had to visit from these western grebe, which I think you're able to distinguish them from the Clark's grebe because their eyes are in the dark part of their face as opposed to the white part of their face. They stayed around for a few weeks and were fun to watch. A lot of double-crested cormorant this winter. I enjoy watching them, especially when they're stretching their wings out to dry. This little guy swimming with the mallard, American coot. Almost always see a great blue heron in the slough. There's one that hangs out by the little beaver dam near the pedestrian bridge. So he's like the park ambassador. He's there to greet all the visitors that are crossing over the bridge. Some more pictures of great blue heron. And I have seen green heron as well in the slough, but I don't have any pictures of them. They're hiding for the winter, I think. I haven't seen them around. The belted kingfisher. And there are some shorebirds, especially when there's more mud in the slough. Definitely see killdeer. Some greater yellow legs. There's another picture of killdeer and greater yellow legs. And then these guys are a little harder to spot sometimes because they kind of blend in with the mud and the rocks in the slough. But once you see those stripes, they're pretty hard to miss. These guys showed up one morning, and as soon as they saw me, they took off and squeezed through those little holes in the chain link fence and were gone, but that was fun to see the quail. love seeing the bald eagles. And they seem to be around year round. I felt like they were gone for a little while, but then they were back. And I don't know if it's a different group that comes in the winter than the ones that breed. But I do enjoy seeing them. And they nest on Minto Brown, I believe. So. Also, another raptor, red-tailed hawk.
Quick note on the eagle, there is a nest due west of the park. If you stand where that viewing spot is with the 2 or 3 trash cans and a couple of benches, sort of halfway between the footbridge and the steamboat, and look due west, there's a big nest in the trees there, about 6 layers in, and they nest there as well.
Great. And another raptor. And that's taken from the bridge too. And I've learned my common sparrows in the park. This is a song sparrow. Pretty golden crown sparrow. Guy with the bicycle helmet. And little fox sparrow. And are you guys able to see these pictures? I
Yes.
can't see them because
Yeah,
the
we can see them
panelists.
fine.
Hmm?
We can see them fine.
Okay, great. So we got just some random songbirds that I've seen as well. Pretty scrub jay. See the black phoebe pretty often. This bird, I could not identify at first, so this was one that I had to take home and study in the field guide because I'd never seen an orange crown warbler before, but that was a fun one to find. This tree was full of bush tits, and I took a bunch of pictures, and this was the only one that turned out, of course, because they were moving so fast. So I was glad to get a picture of one. That's our little Buick's Wren. And I've been surprised with how few pigeons I've seen in the park, but they do come because I think of them as a park bird, but they're not there very often. But I always see one of these guys. And this one really wanted me to take his picture that day. He kept flying around while I had my camera out. So. And that's all the slides I have. So if there's any questions.
Provide your tech support there.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any question. Well, yeah, I don't see any questions for you, Gretchen.
All right.
Your presentation sure shows how much variety you can find in Waterfront Park. So wonderful place to go for, and you could do it in a half hour. I mean, you know, that's the nice
Yeah.
thing. You don't have to go a long ways. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Next, we're going to move on to our own president and treasurer, Tim Johnson. Tim is going to show us the birds that can be seen on the Ankeny boardwalk. Very popular place to go birding. The boardwalk is a mile long and at different times of year has different birds. So Tim, go ahead.
Thank you, Judy. See if I can share my screen here now. Oop, no. I don't want to give it away yet. So like Gretchen, my talk is as much about a place that I really like and bird a lot as it is photos of the birds, but it'll be a combination of those. So the title of my talk is Ankeny National Wildlife Refuge Rail Trail, a walk on the wild side. So the refuge is located about 10 miles south of Salem. You probably all know that. And to get to the boardwalk, in case you haven't been there before, if you take Ankeny Hill Road here off of Highway 5, and then at the split, go down Wind Hill Road, that will take you on the south side of the refuge. And then just look for the sign that marks the entrance to the rail trail parking lot. And once you park, then there's a sign that marks the trailhead. So it's pretty easy to find. And lots of information there about the walk and what you can do and what you can't do. So the trail starts out as a kind of a soft gravel trail and takes you through some grassy area and then through a stand of cottonwoods and willows. And this is what it looks this time of year. It's pretty leafless, which is really nice for seeing birds. They have no place to hide. So, and there are a lot of birds in the woods as you go in. There's just a ton of insects in these trees, and you can find all kinds of things just before you even get to the boardwalk. It's a fun time of year, especially about mid-morning when everything starts waking up. The sounds and the sights are just very surreal. So the trail in the summer continues on to some wetlands, marshy area in the south of the rail trail area, but it's closed this time of year. In the summer, in past summers, we've seen yellow-headed blackbirds back in there. There's a really nice open pond back there that attracts migrating shorebirds and other things. So it's a nice addition to the rail trail. But in the winter, you're stopped here. And if you turn to the right, then you see the beginning of the boardwalk. So the boardwalk was built in 1990 when Jim Koenig was the project leader at the refuge. The project leader is the senior person for the refuge complex. And Rich Cadagno was the manager for Ankeny and Basket Slough at the time of the building of this boardwalk. So that was 21 years ago. And it's showing its age. There's some rough spots along the way, especially when trees start falling on it, which I've heard rumors there have been some trees recently, but the refuge staff is pretty good about getting in there and clearing those trees off there as soon as they can and making what repairs they can. So as Judy said, that the boardwalk's about a mile long. And all along the way are different kinds of trees, mostly cottonwoods, but there's also ash and large leaf maple and some willows. And there's also some fruit-bearing plants in here. So then as you make your way, you'll encounter this observation area where it looks out over Wood Duck Pond. And then if you continue off to the left in this picture, you come to the end of the boardwalk. So the end of the boardwalk, you can just see it over here. In the summer, you can keep on going and walk out onto the out onto this levee and make a big, nice loop around Wood Duck Pond. But in the winter, you can't go past the end of the boardwalk. So this is looking out to the right now, out onto Wood Duck Pond. So in the winter, rail trail is a lowland area for the refuge. And so when the rains start, this area floods pretty good, which is why there's a boardwalk there.
Jim, Teresa Byrne just on chat said that the rail trail was now closed.
Okay, well, they probably are doing repairs. They did close this winter too during that ice storm, and they had to get in there with chainsaws and do some repairs. So yeah, I kind of expected that, but I don't know how you would know if it's when it opens. I suspect it won't be closed all winter. Usually they try to get it open because they know
It says that its trees fell on the boardwalk, knocked out part of it, and then there are photos on the Friends of the Refuge Facebook page. So that's probably how you'll know when it reopens.
that'd be a good
Apparently
place
it's
to
fallen
check.
trees.
That'd be
Yeah.
a good place to check.
Yeah.
Well, that's too bad because it's a wonderful winter bird walk. So it's a nice transition between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, and attracts a lot of different wildlife, including a wide variety of birds. I've personally seen 120 species on that boardwalk. It's one of the birdiest areas in the county. I think the Ankeny in general is number one, probably next to Minto, and then the rail trail is right up there, one of the top spots at the refuge. And it's one of the most popular areas too, especially in winter, because all the other trails, pretty much all the other trails at the refuge are closed in the winter. So it gives people a place to get out. And you can find wood ducks there on Wood Duck Pond. And they're fairly common. I think you can't expect one every time you go there, but they are seen there regularly. And during the summer, you would find other ducks like this blue-winged teal. They breed here in the valley and at the rail trail marsh, as well as cinnamon teals. There are winter, another summer breeding duck, as well as American bitterns. So I took this photo from the boardwalk. Here's a pair, I believe, a breeding pair with a male looking over the nest of a female that's sitting on eggs.
Wow.
The other thing I like about the boardwalk is these birds are just right in your face. I mean, they are so close. It's a really good, it sort of reminds me of McGee Marsh. You know, the birds are just right there. You could almost touch them. So this is a Savannah Sparrow. Other summer birds that you can find, summer warblers, the Wilson's warbler and the common yellowthroat. And yellow warblers, probably our most numerous warbler there. Here's a female carrying nesting material. There's some other warblers you can see there, black-throated grays. I don't have a photo of them for tonight. This would be bunties singing. And if you get lucky, you can see a Virginia rail chick. That little black thing is a Virginia rail chick. So the rail trail, what the bird that the boardwalk was named after, it does live there. And once in a while you can see their babies. Also in the summer, sometimes this bird will show up. It's not a common bird for the valley. House wren. There was a pair of them at the start of the boardwalk. I think it was last summer. and they were there all summer. So they were breeding. I never did see their nest cavity. And of course, marsh wrens are there year round. Lots of year-round birds. Wren tits, not a common bird, but they do show up there. In the winter, things change, and the residents are still there, but we get our winter birds come in, like the yellow rump warbler. Both the myrtles and the audubons will show up, and sometimes in huge numbers. Roy Garrick has told me he's seen 150 of them there at one time, just moving through in waves, but some of them will stick around and spend the winter. And our waterfowl change too, and the blue-winged teal and the cinnamon teal leave, and they're replaced with these green-winged teal. And those are there in big numbers. The nice thing is in winter, these ducks go into their breeding plumage because they'll pair up in the winter, even though they're not going to breed until later. They're in full regalia. And the widgeons are there, both the American and the Eurasian widgeon. And sometimes in big numbers, they're on wood duck pond. And of course, the dusky Canada goose, which the refuge was set up to provide winter grounds for, as you know. And they can be found there in pretty big numbers. I was driving down Buena Vista yesterday and stopped to see if there was any raptors on the field, and there was about 250 of these altogether, and with them were 65 snow geese. I don't think I've ever seen a snow goose from the rail trail, but you could probably see them fly over. Another winter bird, this beautiful Lincoln sparrow. And our Pacific wren, usually heard before seen. And also in the winter, the kinglets come down from the higher elevations where they breed, and they'll spend the winter in the valley. So there's lots of these ruby crowned kinglets. They're so active that you can't hardly miss them because they're all over the place, and they can be pretty vocal with their calls. And again, close up, you get such good looks at them. Another reason I really like the rail trail is these birds, they just don't seem to care about us, and they're just making a living. And the golden crown kinglet, in his stunning white eyebrow, golden crown. And brown creepers are seen year round. There's a lot of them there that you can see on the rail trail. It's better if you can hear them because sometimes you can't see them. They blend in pretty good. This guy is sticking out pretty well, but sometimes they'll turn that brown to you and you can't tell them from the tree. But if you got a good ear, you can hear them vocalizing all the time.
Nope.
And white-breasted nuthatches live there, they're resident. They'll breed in the nest cavities. And if you get lucky, you can, in the summer, in the spring, see them at their nest cavity along the rail trail. I have seen that. Another resident is this black phoebe, our winter flycatcher. So this is a baby. You can tell by that yellow gape, but he's learned to catch flies. So that photo was taken near the observation, near that shelter, that what do you call a photo blind? He seems to like that photo blind. He's around that photo blind a lot, that observation blind a lot. Another bird you can usually hear before you see him. He's got a fairly distinctive call note. And Bewick's wren, the ubiquitous Bewick's wren. If you can't figure out what it is, it's probably a Bewick's wren. Joel Geyer tells me about their call. Their calls are all over the map. They're always fun to see. Again, that striking white eyebrow. So here's a bird you don't get to see very often. This bird was seen this fall. I didn't take this picture. This picture was taken by Ken Pitts. I went down there every day for a week or so trying to find this bird because it had been reported. Joe Blowers told me about it, told me exactly where he saw it. A lot of us went down trying to find it, an American tree sparrow. But rarities do show up there, and this was our fall rarity. There was also an ash-throated flycatcher seen there late summer. I didn't get to see him either. But the highlight of last winter had to be a bird that was there for all winter. And maybe some of you got to see it. There was about 10 of these long-eared owls that were roosting very close to the boardwalk. So just another reason to go down to the boardwalk whenever you can, because you never know what you're going to run into there. I invite all of you to get down there as often as you can and take a walk on the wild side.
Jim, there's Mary Schmidgall says, I've heard the parking lot has had a fair amount of vandalism in the past. Is it still a concern? I've avoided going there because of that.
Well, it does, you don't want to leave anything in your car that, you don't want to leave anything in your car that might be tempting. It's like everywhere in the refuge. There's break-ins off and on everywhere in the refuge. The rail trail parking lot's somewhat secluded, but it gets a lot of traffic. I never feel reluctant to go there. I know people have had their cars broken into. People have had their cars broken into Minto Brown. It seems like there's that risk. Yes, there is that risk. Never go there though, or anywhere really, and leave anything in sight that looks like it might be of value. I think is your best strategy. I don't think the break-ins are enough to keep me away from there. That's for sure.
Celine Living Good asked, what sort of camera do you use?
Well, I use a Nikon D500 camera body. It's a crop sensor camera. It's Nikon's top of the line crop sensor camera. Cost about $1,000. And I have I had a Sigma 150 to 500 for a while, and I upgraded to the Tamron 150 to 600 G2. So I've tried those other cameras, the super zooms, and I just cannot get things in focus. I just can't get the birds photographed the way I want them. So that's why I carry that big heavy camera around. But it only weighs about 6 pounds. I have a nice big strap that I use, and it distributes the weight pretty well. It focuses so quick that's why I use that camera and that camera exclusively. I only have one camera body and I only have one lens. And it's because most of what I shoot is birds. Once in a while, I will digiscope with my iPhone, and that can work really well. I've gotten some stunning pictures that way too, better than I could get with my camera under the same conditions. Sometimes the spotting scope, I've got a nice Swarovski spotting scope, which has got a beautiful lens on it. And even though that sensor in the iPad and the iPhone is tiny compared to my big camera, it can capture some pretty nice images sometimes.
Oh, and that's interesting. Thank you, Tim. And we will move on
Thank
to
you.
our last photo sharers, Albert Rickman and Harry Fuller. Albert is a retired medical doctor from Albany. He's been photographing birds, he said, for about 6 years. And he loves camera gear. And if you have any questions about cameras, type them in your chat space. Harry Fuller is our leader for Birders Night. He has been birding for many years, lived in San Francisco for a long time, and while he was there, he learned every gull and all the stages of feathering that gull had. That always impressed me when I heard that. Harry also is the author of 2 birding books, one about birding I-5 and one about owls. So Harry and Albert, Harry's going to be the narrator. Albert was the cameraman. So go ahead, Harry.
Thank you very much. Yes, Albert and I chatted last summer, and he was anxious to get to the coast and see some of the good birds. And so we talked about it. And one of the best birding spots in Central California, particularly from October through April, is Bodega Bay. And he found a safe place for us to stay, not too far away. So we went down to Bodega Bay. This guy here on the left is one of the local residents. This is a bird, sadly, that we don't get this far north very often. This is a snowy egret, and they tend to like to stop at the California border. Occasionally you'll see them in Klamath. But by the time you get down to Central California, they're quite common. And this guy wasn't actually, I don't think, this angry at Albert, but there was another snowy egret nearby. And this guy was showing off exactly how ferocious he could be if that other egret got into his territory. And we just happened to be standing nearby. And Albert, as always, had his camera on the ready. We did make a couple of stops on the way down. We drove, of course, not a good time to be in an airplane or a train. This picture on the right just shows you a little bit of what we went through. This is Lake Shasta before the rainy season started, and it's basically Shasta Lake. It was about a 100-foot drop from the parking lot down to water level. And I don't think Shasta has gotten much higher since then. It's as low as the lake had been since it was built and the dam was put in place. And we, of course, made our obligatory stop in Jackson County. For some reason, Albert thinks these great gray owls that somebody wrote a book about are kind of cool to get pictures of. So we went up in the mountains, and there, of course, was a great gray owl right in the meadow where he was supposed to be. And Albert got a whole slew of pictures, but I'm only going to show you this one. So if you want to see a great gray owl, just send me an email sometime. We'll talk about it. This is what it was like in most of California. The Central Valley was quite dry. Almost all the reservoirs were dry. The rivers were down to nothing. And you'd drive by businesses. This happened to be on somebody's private house out at Point Reyes. Extremely sensitive to water use. And it hasn't gotten much better. They really haven't. From Ashland south, they're getting very little rain again this year, even though they had one big storm. It's not going to be enough to make up for the drought. So we went to Bodega Bay where there's water everywhere. It's all salt water. There are some little salt marshes along the edge, but basically what you've got is a huge bay with a fishing fleet. You've got sand spits. You've got forest on the edge. You've got some areas where there's housing, but there's a lot of open coastal scrub. And you've got really strong tides. So you've got birds moving constantly during the day, either going where the water's deeper, where the water's shallow, where the mud flats are, where the sands bars are, where the gravel bars are. So it attracts a really rich collection of both local and Arctic birds that like saltwater coastline, because you've got just about everything. You've got mud for the birds that like mud. You've got exposed rocks for birds like oyster catchers that like exposed rocks. You've got sand spits for birds like plovers and sanderlings. You've got deep water for things like pelagic cormorants and brown pelicans and surf goaters, but you've got lots of shallow water for paddling ducks. And one of the great events when you're in an area like this in the winter, you've got all these brown pelicans. They're gone now, by the way. So if you want to see brown pelicans in a mass, you've got to be in Central California outside the breeding season, which basically is June through Christmas. And now they've already headed back south, and they're already starting to nest now in Santa Barbara and Catalina Island and Baja. But when they're here through Christmas, and they form these gigantic flocks, and they go looking for the nearest school of fish. And unlike our big, plodding, slow-moving white pelicans, these guys are great divers. And it was really exciting to watch. Sometimes it'd be 50 or 60 of them, and they'd find a school of fish, and they're dropping in like feathered darts. They're coming down at 30, 40 miles an hour, splashing beak first into the water. And what you can't believe when you're watching them is, how the hell are they seeing the fish? The water's churning, the wind is blowing, 18 other pelicans have just smashed into the water, and yet somehow they are able to see what they're going after. And they come up, sometimes they come up with more than one, and when they get a fish in their beak, they'll throw their head back and let it slide head first down into their gullet. It's just amazing to watch them. A real quick note, it takes 3 years for the brown pelican to go from baby to adult. The ones with the white heads are the 3-year-old adults that are of breeding age. The really dark ones are the first-year birds, and they start to lighten up a little bit around the face in their second year. So you've got a mix here of everything from mom and dad to junior. And these guys have all come up from Southern California and Mexico to hunt along the California and Oregon coast because we have so many more fish up here. This was one of the most interesting things, and we saw this multiple times. The white pelicans, after their bellies are full, will pull up onto the beach and nap and preen and yawn and just sort of hang out, loaf, basically. And then the brown pelicans will come and join them. So if you look along the edge, you see brown pelicans side by side with their much bigger white pelican cousins on the same beach. And then, of course, you'll end up getting, gulls and shorebirds. And sometimes on this little mud spit, there would be as many as 15 different species of birds, all loafing together. And right up here is the road. So if you want to take a picture, you can walk to get out of your car, you're within 25 feet of some of these birds loafing on the edge of Bodega Bay. So the white pelicans are trawlers. We talked about the brown pelicans and how they're divers. But on the left, you have a little quartet of white pelicans, and they're way too big and way too heavy to be able to afford to dive in the water. I mean, they would be going so fast, they'd probably break their neck the first time. So they fish on the surface, and they will get in a line or sometimes a circle, and they'll chase a school of fish or encircle it if there's enough of them. And they use those huge beaks of theirs basically to seine the fish out of the water. And they'll get as many of them as they can in their beak, and you'll see the water squirting out at the base of their beak as they push it out with their tongue. And then they, like their brown cousins, they throw their head back like this one guy's starting to do here. They'll throw their head back and then the fish just slide right down into the gullet. The white pelican, by the way, is the second largest wingspan in North America. It's just slightly less than the California condor. So when you do see them in the air, we didn't see them in the air very much at Bodega. They mostly were eating and sleeping because their stomachs were full. But if you see them in the air in a place like Malheur, and they start to fly, they'll get up into big circles, sometimes a quarter of a mile in the air. Those huge big wings with tiny little black patches out near the tip. And they can soar for hours without flapping because their wings are so big. Shorebirds. This is Shorebird Heaven in the winter. As I said, it's got everything. It's got mud, it's got sand, it's got gravel, it's got a mixture of anything any possible shorebird could want, except for lots of parking lots. Actually, there are even some parking lots. So if you're a killdeer, you can feel right at home. This was a big flock. One of the first shorebird flocks we ran into was mostly godwits. Here's one coming into land, marble godwit. You can see that beak of his slightly curved up at the end. Really nice shot Albert got of this guy with his wings open. This guy down here, not really a godwit. This is a willet, and you often see them together. You'll see the willet beak is about 2/3 the length of a godwit, and it's straight, so it's much more of a prober. The godwit has all sorts of really interesting techniques, and you can open that beak at the end, turn it into a little pair of tweezers to pull stuff out of the mud. So you often see them together because they're not really competing. The godwit is getting to stuff that's 1 inch or 2 inches deeper in the mud than the willet. The willet often will grab stuff almost right off the surface, like a stilt or an avocet. The godwit is a mud prober, and they have tested godwits, and they realize now, and we've known for a long time, that the tip of the beak is full of all kinds of sense organs. They can smell, they can taste, they can feel. It's like a combination of your tongue, your nose, and your forefinger, all in this tiny little area down here, all tiny little nerve endings, extremely sensitive. So what the godwit is doing, and dowitchers do it all the time too, is he's probing in the mud or the sand, and he sends out shock waves. And if they hit something like a mussel shell or a clam and bounce back, they see the change in the signal. And they go, oh, there's a mussel shell over there. They walk over, probe in the mud, pull it out, and break it open and eat it. So their beak, when they're probing, this is not random like you or I if we're sticking our finger into a bowl of mud looking for a hidden marble. These guys are picking up all kinds of sensory data every time they stick their beak in the mud. So it's much less random and much more informed hunting. This was probably one of the 3 or 4 best pictures that we couldn't have dreamed of this, but when we got it, this was like, can't believe what we're seeing. First of all, we went down on the sandy beach to look for these guys, Snowy Plovers. There's a small colony that nests there, and they stick around all winter. And the Snowy Plovers are like siskins. They're really mean to each other. They form a flock, but they don't share. They don't like each other. They're pushing each other all the time, calling each other names. I mean, they're chattering at each other all the time, but it's not friendly. It's like a bunch of really competitive kindergartners. This guy is a sanderling, and they come down from the Arctic, and he just wants an easy winter, and he wants lots of food, and they like exactly the same kind of habitat. So we were near a mixed flock of Snowy Plovers chasing each other and sanderlings trying to rest, and the wind was blowing really hard. So this little guy, this little plover, went into one of these little divots to get out of the wind, and his cousin, the sanderling, came in and cuddled up next to him. They were literally shoulder to shoulder, and they were like that for half an hour. A plover who couldn't be next to another plover because they were all too competitive, cuddled up next to a sanderling who's about twice his size. I mean, I have never seen this happen before, certainly not in the wild. I mean, you see all the time that, you know, a dog will adopt a baby rabbit or something, but this was 2 wild shorebirds on an open beach deciding to share body heat. Anyway, we had more than just the Snowy Plover here on the left, and I would guess there were at least 2 dozen, maybe as many as 35 Snowy Plovers in that little flock, and they were huddled pretty close together, even though they didn't share. But then we found these guys. It was a pretty good sized flock of semi-palmated plovers, and here he is pulling out a snack, a little sea worm coming right out of the rocks. And these guys were in a whole different habitat. As you can see, these guys like pure sand. These guys were on a rocky beach And in fact, they were on the same beach where we, at a different time, saw a big flock of black turnstones. So this is a much different kind of habitat. Here to get food, you're gonna have to run out to the ocean. I mean, there's nothing living in this sand. Maybe if you could dig really fast, you might find something down 3 or 4 inches. But these guys have to run out and get their living at the edge of the waves. That's how sanderlings make their living. They're running back and forth. Right as the water goes out, they grab the little shrimp and stuff before they can dig into the sand. Well, the snowy plovers do the same thing. But over here, these guys, like the turnstones, are poking around in the weeds, looking next to the rocks, checking in the seaweed on the edge of the rock, looking for stuff that if a wave breaks, maybe this little worm comes up and wiggles his tail, and this guy grabbed it before he could get back in the water. Ooh. I don't know what way. Let's see. I don't know what happened here.
You got out of
You're
presentation mode.
you're okay. Just go to the next one is the
There we go.
is the
There we go.
turnstones.
You
Yeah.
got it.
Okay. Turnstones. We know they turn stones. We know that's how they got their name. We watched them going on the seaweed packed beach, a pretty good sized flock, probably 30 to 40 of them. They were turning weeds as well. They would walk along, and when the tide was out, when the waves were out, the weed would still be quite wet, but it would just be lying down on the sand, and they would come up and they would flip it over and grab all the stuff that was underneath. Unbelievably how fast they were, because the creatures they find underneath are things like shrimp, tiny little worms, occasionally a snail or some other kind of mollusk. But these guys were faster than anything underneath the seaweed. So they'd go along, flipping over the seaweeds and grabbing all the food underneath. Very sharp little characters and sharp little beaks. Here's one, he's watching, taking note of what's moving around in the weeds just below the rock where he is. These guys were so cooperative, I couldn't believe it. I don't know, Albert and I must have gotten within 15 feet of these guys, and they just ignored us. I mean, they were, you know, right at the edge of a busy parking lot where people are putting their boats in and taking their boats out. They could have cared less. We were completely irrelevant. It was all between them and the brine shrimp. And here's a big flock. A lot of these are Dunlin, but I think there's probably some Western sandpipers in there, and maybe even some leaf sandpipers, because you've got 2 or 3 different sizes of birds. And what was going on at Bodega Bay, because it's fairly deep, it's right on the ocean with a narrow channel coming in and out. So a lot of the places where you get narrow channels and there's tides, the tides are pretty extreme. They come in really fast and they disappear really fast. 10 o'clock in the morning, the water may be right up to the edge of the parking lot. You come back at 1:30 and you're 500 yards from the nearest piece of water. It's all sand and mud because it's relatively shallow until you get right out in the middle. So when the tide goes out, it goes out really quickly. It doesn't just go a few feet away from the rock. It goes 150 yards. So the birds, all of them, depending on how they hunt, have to keep up with the tides. If you're going to sleep on the beach and you're a white pelican, you don't want to be sleeping in 6 inches of water. So you go to the beach where the tide either doesn't reach it or the area where the tide is out. If you're a shorebird like this with fairly small beaks, you can wade around maybe in 2 or 3 inches of water, but you're not going to be out when the water's 6 inches deep like it is if you're a godwit. You can't even reach the bottom of the bay that way. So you've got to move with the water. You've got to time your landing and your hunting and your preening and even your loafing to be in the right place at the right time, depending on where the tide is. So this area, when you're birding there, it's constant flux. This is not like birding in a grassy field where the meadowlarks nest in one place and they spend the entire day within 50 yards of their nest. In winter, particularly when it's really about calories, wind, food, and where I can rest carefully, these birds are constantly in motion. And every flock has its preferences for what they want, what they need. Is it time to nap? Did we eat a really big breakfast? So now it's 11:30 in the morning and we just want to find a nice peaceful place we can rest and not have to worry about peregrines. So every one of these birds, even when they're a member of a flock, is making determination about where it's safe, where it's going to feed, where it's going to rest. And almost all of that is determined by tide and wind. And if you look carefully in this flock, this is a Dunlin here. Whoops. This guy here with the bigger wings is a Dunlin. This is probably a Western sandpiper. See the difference in size and wingspan? So I think there's at least 2, there may be 3 different species of peeps in these flocks, and that's very common. It's not at all uncommon. You get sanderlings next to plovers, you get sandpipers next to Dunlin, you get godwits, willets, sometimes dowitchers all mixed in together. So it's a really good, fun place to go practice your identification of shorebirds. And I won't mention the gulls, but there are lots of gulls. And you can get up to 8 species of gull there in the winter. Here he is giving the frown to the other guy. And here he is preening. And this was interesting. And up here, we don't get to see this because we don't have these particular guys. We're used to egrets, great egrets. We're used to blue herons. We're used to the way they stalk their prey, the way they stand still, either in a field or at the shallow edge of a pond or in a marsh and wait and wait and wait for food. These guys have a completely different technique that the big herons and egrets don't use. They will stir the bottom with their foot. They create a little tidal wave and it sucks stuff off the bottom, and they're watching. They're moving, swirling the water around with the right foot or their left foot, not both at once, obviously. They stand on one leg and swirl the bottom with the other. And if it stirs up anything of interest, they grab it with that dart-shaped beak of theirs. So they're stirring the bottom. These guys were common in all the places where rocks are common. Oyster catchers are there year-round. They nest on the offshore rocks. Their nutcracker strength beak is used to crush mussel shells or chitons or anything they can pull off the rock. They crack them open and then pull the meat out with that beautiful orange beak, and then they eat it. And you're used to seeing them fly around, and they have that loud when they're flying. So you often, like a Pacific wren, you may hear them before you see them. And then you'll see these big black birds flying around. And this is where you expect to see them. You expect to see them on the rocks because that's where they feed. Occasionally they'll sleep maybe on a beach, but I think 95% of the time when I've seen a oyster catcher and it's not in the air, it's standing on a rock. So that's what we saw and that's what we expected. But then comes the dawn. This guy was 30 feet offshore. As you can see, those are not short legs. Those are probably 5 to 6 inches of pink leg before you get to the feathers. So here he is. He's in at least 3 to 4 inches of muddy water. The tide is flowing really fast, so it's swirling sand and seaweed. So maybe he's got the best eyes on the planet. Maybe he can see better than an osprey. He certainly can't smell in the water. But my guess is, and what we saw happening, he was walking along very slowly, very carefully. He was prodding the mud with his toes. He was feeling for stuff to eat. He would find, like this, a snail, pull it out with a foot, poke his beak down, take it out of the foot, bring it up, crush it, and eat it. He was using his toes to find lunch. Now, first of all, I don't think I'd ever seen an oyster catcher hunt in water with a muddy bottom before. I'm used to seeing them poke around in the seaweeds on the rocks and pulling off shells and flipping over seaweed and doing what rocky shorebirds are supposed to do, which is feed on the rocks like a good turnstone or a tattler. But this guy had learned, or maybe they've always done it and we just don't know it. He was going through He was going through mud, using his toes to find mollusks, pulling them up out of the mud and then grabbing the shell and eating them. He had our total attention. And that's the picture I'm going to end on, because this is nothing I ever would have predicted. And I've been watching oyster catchers for 30 years, and I've never seen anything even similar to this before. And not only was he doing it, he managed to pose for Albert, and because he wasn't that far away, he completely ignoring all the other birds. There's gulls all around him. There's pelicans diving about 30 feet away. There were bigger shorebirds between us and him, like godwits and stuff. He was totally focused on getting a total meal, and he got one. So I can't over recommend Bodega Bay between October and April. One of the birds we did miss because they weren't there yet, but they're now there in huge numbers, is brant. It's a great place for loons, all three cormorants, all three species of coastal loon, all three species of scoters. If you go to Bodega Bay, you can bird yourself crazy for 4 days.
And we did.
And we did. Any questions?
Myron Lee asked, can you comment on camera equipment and technique?
Yeah, I was using a full frame Nikon D850. I had my 600 millimeter prime, and I also had my 180 to 400 was a 1.4 teleconverter as my primary telephoto lenses. So I think I actually had my D500 as well. So some of the pictures were probably from the D500, all Nikon equipment at that time.
Thank you, Albert.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, Kathy.
I was trying to use chat, but for some reason it doesn't let me type in my question. But I'm just curious, are oyster catchers also threatened in California like they are in Oregon?
They are sensitive to anything that happens to small shellfish along the coast. The heat dome may have been really bad for them because I know that the death of small tidal area creatures during the heat dome here in Oregon and Washington was horrific. I've seen estimates of billions of organisms died because of exposure and heat. They're not used to that. The ocean here, like it is in California, Northern California, is basically 55 degrees. And, you know, they can deal with 58, they can deal with 61, but if they have to start dealing with 75 and 80, it kills them. So I suspect that this may be a really bad year for oyster catchers. They are too small to matter for them to matter about the sea urchin starfish crisis that's threatening otters and other bigger predators. They're mostly dependent on, you know, chitons, snails, mussels, creatures of that size, mostly that are fixed onto the rocks with threads, which they actually can chew through. And they don't eat fish and frogs and minnows and stuff like that. It's almost entirely shellfish. So we won't really know until spring, I think. And the real test will be, do they breed? Almost all these coastal birds, if something has happened to the food supply, I remember a couple of years during El Nino when we lived in California, the western gulls wouldn't even mate. They wouldn't even bother to court. There was no food, they weren't going to lay eggs. The cormorants wouldn't even gather on the rocks where they normally nest. You'd find cormorants miles from the nearest nesting site in the middle of June because they were just starving and they were going anywhere to get food. And if that's the situation for oyster catchers, these guys, unlike oyster catchers I've seen elsewhere, East Coast European oyster catchers, much more adaptable. I can remember walking through a field in Scotland 5 miles from the nearest saltwater, and it was full of oyster catchers running around like killdeer But these guys don't do that. They feed, except for that one guy, they mostly feed on the rocks. And even if they're able to feed in the mud, if the snails and other